So got James Crossley this side and Robert Miles, my right-hand side. So I don't know about the differences. Okay, you can ask them that later on. I was intrigued by the title, Jesus, a Life in Class Conflict. And so I got an opportunity because the person who was supposed to be chairing it had a little bit of a mishap. So I said, if I wouldn't mind coming along to this, because I really do want to understand the life and the environment and the conditions and of that first century and what was going on in the life of Jesus in Nazareth in Palestine. I look forward to the talk from both these fine gentlemen here. One's come all the way from New Zealand, so it's a long way to come. New Zealand, Australia, exactly. Yeah.
But I'm from this.
Originally from New Zealand, yeah. Yes. I try to read up a little bit. And James is from England, but working in Oslo. So well, welcome to both of you. I'm going to now be quiet and listen. Thank you.
Okay. This is more for you to look at than learn. It's a curious thing to talk about the historical Jesus in the context of... Oh, we're not going on the screen.
And if I look from that side, because I can't see the screen, you've seen it, so I'll sit.
Yeah, that's fine.
Side.
Yeah.
See online, that's
Well,
Can they see it online?
should be able to see online. Few people from either side.
But if they send them,
Do that. Do that.
yeah.
Well, that's fine. So, as I said, it's a curious setting to discuss the historical Jesus in Mark's Memorial Library. I think for many people, why even bother with something like the historical Jesus? What even is the historical Jesus? I think this is an unfortunate mistake, and it wasn't always the case. I'll talk about it in a minute. But to go right back to the beginning, what do we mean by the historical Jesus? And I'm putting this crudely, and I know people critique it, but it's a useful way of defining what we're doing. When we talk about the historical Jesus, we're talking about the figure who was walked and active in Galilee and Judea around the year 30 or a few years before, and in distinction from the development, the myth-making, the Christian deification of Christ after his death. So some people like to use the distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And that's just a helpful way of thinking about what we're doing. We're talking about a reconstruction of a historical figure in Galilee, Judea, around that time. To undermine what I've just said a little bit more, we're not that certain about what we can say about the individual figure in terms of the details, the biographical details. Some of this stuff is It's very, very difficult to say whether this did happen, whether this didn't happen. So we're happy with the idea of early themes from around that part of the world that are associated with Jesus and his followers, that we can reasonably say were present in Galilee, Judea around the year 30 and things like that. And we can build up some sort of narrative around that. So why should people at the Marx Memorial Library even care about the historical Jesus? Well, for a start, Marx and Engels were very interested in the development of human history, the shifts in modes of production and so on, and historical materialist readings of everything else has been done, from medieval uprisings through to the emergence of capitalism and so on. But the ancient world often gets left out of this. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but the ancient world is a bit more difficult, I think, for Marxists to talk about the mode of production because of lack of data and things like this.
Sorry.
So, I mean, the quest for the historical Jesus, I mean, you can find starting points anytime you want, but it really gets going at the end of the 18th century. And it really gets going with the emergence of capitalism, interestingly enough. And what you start to get is this human figure of Jesus, Jesus the teacher, Jesus, this kind of radical figure, in distinction from the old feudalistic, monarchistic Christ of faith. So it becomes a part of the emerging bourgeoisie in Europe to talk about the life of Jesus, the lives of Jesus, the quest for historical Jesus. Beside this, you also get the emergence of working class traditions and dissenting traditions talking about the historical Jesus, both to undermine the old aristocratic feudal order, but also to undermine the emerging bourgeoisie. So this takes place in Central Europe, but it also takes place in England. And one of the most prominent early advocates of really trying to find out who the historical Jesus was, or what little we might even know about him, was Thomas Paine. He was a very influential writer on this in England. It was picked up by Spencean radicals, very controversially saying that Jesus was a slave, for instance, who preached anti-Roman rhetoric and so on and so forth. And Engels did that in England, the working classes were reading cheap translations of radical German historical Jesus scholarship. And if you look at some of the Chartist newspapers at the time, it's very common for working class writers and working class audiences to be interested in the historical Jesus, and he's understood in class-based terms. He's against the dominant class of his day. He represents the equivalent of the working class of his day. They would use language like working class at this time, or something like that. So it has been there in the tradition in this country, but really there has been very, very little written on the historical Jesus since. There's plenty of reasons we could go into from historical materialist perspective, Marxist perspective, and so on. So we try to address this. And one of the ways we do is to look at the conditions in Galilee as Jesus was growing up, the building projects that were taking place as Jesus was growing up, where the urban centres dominate the countryside, they extract surplus, they extract resources from the countryside, and these two projects are happening as Jesus grows up, and we think this is very important for understanding why this movement emerges. Robert will talk a little bit more about that in due course. We also think about how do you articulate class antagonisms in the ancient world. It's not quite as straightforward as trying to work out how working class may have articulated their concerns in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century. But there are some important models. Eric Hobsbawm, for instance, has been credited with the idea of understanding pre-political revolt, and he would understand things like apocalypticism, a fantastical way of understanding a new world order, as something that is really typical of pre-modern, pre-capitalist agitation. So he would say this stuff gets absorbed and taken up and transformed and developed and modified with the rise of capitalism. So he says in socialist parties, in communist parties, they would take the old apocalyptic language and secularize it, if you like. But this is the kind of language we find in certain kind of ancient agitations, reimagining the world as with a new king, a new benign order, the idea that the poor will be fed, will have plenty, and the rich will be damned. and things like this. It's not an egalitarianism, I think, as a lot of romantic readings of the gospel would have it. I think it's very much based on peasant hierarchies and traditions about just kings and things like this. But it does have a language of expressing how the overthrow of the ruling class and the replacement with a new benign ruling class in the interests of the peasantry. We use phrases like dictatorship of the peasantry deliberately and slightly provocatively to talk about the Jesus movement as representing and articulating the interests of the peasantry. We like it or not, or whether we find it alien or not. Yeah. And so figures like the Jesus movement sort of represent something like the radical intelligentsia of their day and articulate peasant concerns and peasant uprisings and things like this in apocalyptic language. Is there a little arrow if you can? And so part of this apocalypticism is the preaching of the kingdom of God, which could equally and perhaps should be translated something like empire of God or dictatorship of God or dictatorship of the peasantry, as we said. There's a part of this also involves a kind of mission to the rich. Again, Robert will talk about this, but it means, we don't think it articulates the concerns of the peasantry of the lower orders, but it tries to get the wealthy to give up their ways, give up the money, fund the movement and things like this. So we get a very interesting network of a rural network, we get a network of in fishing communities, we get a network with people involved like tax collectors, wealthy people and things like this trying to fund the movement. And probably stage two, and this certainly develops, elite women with time to think about philosophy and so on, seem to have funded this movement to some degree. This also had to be a culturally credible movement. So we talk quite a lot about group discipline, traditional ethics. Some of this has been, I think, misread. So, for instance, there is an upheaval of households where young men would have traditionally taken on the role of the household. People were displaced from the land. We know this in first century Galilee. Gifts of land were given to rich people. And so some young men were not able to take on the traditional household roles. And some people think this articulates a kind of radical rethinking of gender in the first century. I think we would see it as it throws up questions about gender roles in the first century. But what they do is family is the only language they know. So they articulate in terms of an alternative family. And there's disputes over who's the kind of most manly and things like this, Jesus or his opponents. And so we think there's an emphasis on traditional ethics and an emphasis on family and things like this to provide a culturally credible movement. So it would take off and be popular among the peasantry. Yeah. Oh, God. Don't know how that happened. Maybe mine wasn't it? We also argue that the part of these debates over masculinity show themselves in martyrdom. Martyrdom was we think it's a very early tradition, this idea that you would die for the country, you would die for your traditions, you would die to help bring about this new movement. And it was very, very common for figures like Jesus, authoritative figures, to be killed. I mean, Rome or the local rulers will just kill anyone. They don't care if you're violent, non-violent, whatever. If you're a perceived threat with a movement, you might be seen to be a threat, they'll kill you. And this really comes to a head in some of the traditions about what happens in Jerusalem at Passover. Passover is a festival celebrating the exodus from Egypt, the escape from Pharaoh, and in the first century Jewish traditions, this was probably thought of as Rome will come to an end. The Roman Empire will come to an end. And the preaching of the early movement seems to have implied that when this new kingdom comes, Rome will go. And you've got to imagine Passover, when Jesus dies, is heaving, it's packed, and riots can be set off at any given time. So I think the Gospels probably have hints of this, that there is a very sort of secretive way of trying to put Jesus to death, because if you try and put a popular figure to death, you could cause a riot, but you can't have someone who could also have a popular following active around Jerusalem in such a setting. So he ends up on a Roman cross, almost certainly thought, well, popular figure, we'll kill him. We could justify it by saying, the local authorities could justify it by saying this figure was preaching the end of the Roman Empire, and that seems to be the end of the movement. But it continues, and I'll talk a little bit about why it continues at the end. But Robert's going to give an actual summary now, a more detailed summary, if you like, of the book itself.
So yeah, James has done a really good job of kind of contextualizing the broader kind of context in which all this stuff's going on, and some of the general outlines. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple of pages from the book. I might pause at one or two moments just to elaborate as appropriate. This is just from the précis that we have at the end of the introductory chapter. So it's really a summary of the biography. It's a very quick outline of the things to come in the book, keeping in mind that there are some things that are said that you might think, what, they say that? Later in the book, we flesh it out. There's argumentation for it. We consider alternative perspectives and so on. Our historical reconstruction begins by looking at Jesus' upbringing against the backdrop of changing social and economic conditions in first century Galilee. We introduce antagonistic influences on the ordinary Jewish population, and this, as James mentioned before, includes these urbanization projects that were going on in Galilee under Herod Antipas. So two of these projects that we know about had a massive impact on the socioeconomic conditions of that time and place as Jesus was growing up. One of these centers is known as Sepphoris, and was rebuilt in, I think, 6 CE. So, pretty early on in Jesus' life, it had been destroyed by the Romans, and Herod Antipas had it rebuilt so that it could be described by one elite author as the ornament of all Galilee. So this had a major impact on the surrounding rural countryside, extracting resources, dominating water resources, exacerbating the divide between the rich and the poor, and so on. And then about a decade or so later, Antipas builds the city of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, named, of course, in honor of the Roman emperor at the time, Tiberius. So again, the construction of this major city on the lake allowed well-connected elites who are associated with the city to dominate the lake economy and the fishing economy. And of course, we know that several of Jesus's prominent disciples were fishing and involved in that fishing industry. Well, this fishing industry was undergoing a lot of stress and so on under the building of Tiberias. So we outline these sorts of broader material forces and the changing social conditions. And we also consider the influence of other popular movements from the time. For example, John the Baptist is one, but there's a few other interesting Jewish millennial figures that we compare and contrast with the early Jesus movement. And one of the important things that we do as well is that rather than focus on the individual Jesus, which tends to be the modus operandi of historical Jesus research, and kind of evokes a great man approach to history, we seek to reconstruct his life work more plausibly as something more of a socially credible religious organizer, focusing more on the broader social movement, the Jesus movement, or the early Jesus movement that he was a part of, He emerges as a prominent figure of this movement, a movement which was dependent on, but also he functioned as a suitable conduit for the interests of the peasantry in Galilee and Judea. So in doing so, we seek to uncover the social and economic origins behind the formation of this collective Jesus movement, which formed him as a leader. The aims and objectives of the early Jesus movement were clear, at least in the initial stages. Caught up in millenarian and messianic beliefs about God imminently and dramatically intervening in human history to transform the world for the better, the Jesus movement would act as a vanguard political party with its own Politburo and would be installed through decisive divine judgment as the custodians of a new theocracy, a dictatorship serving the interests of the peasantry. Come the revolution, the fortunes of the agrarian world would be turned on their head. Non-elite sectors of Jewish society were guaranteed a life of plenty. The rich, however, would have to relinquish their wealth or suffer ruinous consequences. As part of its work in Galilee, the Jesus movement organized a controversial mission to the rich, as James mentioned earlier, to try and get some of the wealthy on board. And it was moderately successful, perhaps, in these attempts. Kind of whether or not it was successful is moot. Part of our argument for this, and I'll just elaborate on this a little bit more, has to do with the, I think, well-known ideas about that come through in the gospel tradition about Jesus being dining with tax collectors and sinners. We argue, this is based on actual quite kind of painstaking, rigorous research that James has done, looking at Jewish texts from the ancient world over almost 1,000 years, looking at how the word sinner is used. The idea that comes across in conventional wisdom that sinners refers to your kind of poor, downtrodden, societal outcast, and so on. This idea is completely absent in these texts. Within these texts, spanning, as I say, almost 1,000 years, there is a fairly consistent meaning. It refers to, within the Jewish tradition, lawbreakers, breakers of the Mosaic law. And interestingly, whenever the socioeconomic status of these sinners is mentioned, every single time it always refers to them as exploitative rich people who are oppressing the poor. So the idea of Jesus dining with tax collectors and sinners being scandalous is scandalous precisely because he's dining with the wealthy. And so we see this as part of the mission to the rich, to try and get some of the wealthy on board, to get them to give up their wealth. The association of sinners with tax collectors is also interesting because tax collectors are exactly the types of people who would have some of these networks to the wealthier people within Galilee, and also importantly, we should point out, are very much connected to and benefiting from these elite-sponsored building projects, such as Sepphoris and Tiberias. The movement's credibility among the Galilean peasantry was due to its emphasis on traditional peasant values, generous acts of healing, culturally serious interpretations of Jewish scriptures, and strict group discipline, all of which provided a dignified alternative in a changing Galilee. As households were broken up due to elite-sponsored building projects in nearby urban centres, the Jesus movement formed its own alternative household, respectfully mimicking traditional family roles. However, this also provoked reaction and ridicule, and the movement was dismissed by some outsiders as effeminate and unmanly. One of the accusations that's made is that would suggest is that people were suggesting that the early Jesus movement were eunuchs, and Jesus, in one saying, kind of ironically embraces this as, yes, some are eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Alongside this, the movement looked for opportunities to self-present as tough, muscular, hard, and manly, mostly through a redefinition of terms. Masculinity was really important in the ancient world, or understandings and constructions of masculinity. And the Jesus movement and its its understandings of class were being interpreted and kind of sometimes acted out through this lens of masculinity and gender, as it was within broader Roman society. The Emperor of Rome himself is often depicted. We've got an interesting image in the book of one of the Caesars of Rome kind of subjugating the female, pinning down the female personification of a foreign nation. So Rome often understood itself as a kind of violent, conquering, manly military force. And so the Jesus movement had to understand its own negotiations of power within this kind of gendered discourse. Which involved taking it like a man, would ultimately feature as a defining public presentation of their masculinity. But it also spurred them into further skirmishes with the elite. With time being short and passions high, the Jesus movement converged on Jerusalem, located to the south of Galilee in the Roman province of Judea. Their fateful trip to the holy city, where the temple was located, took place during the festival of Passover, again, as James mentioned, when underlying social and political anxieties would regularly flare up. This was often a time for revolt or potential revolt, and a time when the military forces and so on would be trying to suppress any kind of possibility of social tension. As is well known, Jesus' participation in incendiary activities was used by the authorities as the reason to arrest and crucify him. And he is put to death with the sign, or some of the Gospels talk about the sign that's hung above his head on the cross, with a sign displaying his charge. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. In other words, he's put to death as a deranged royal pretender. But this is not, of course, the end of the story, or the movement for that matter. And not long after Jesus' martyred corpse is laid in a tomb by a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, perhaps one of several success stories. If there's historicity to that, we're not sure. But key figures in the early Jesus movement sincerely believed that God had raised him back to life. They were drawing on order established traditions of righteous martyrs dying and actually being raised back to life. So this wasn't necessarily an unexpected thing within that kind of framework. This was a way of sincerely interpreting what was going on. And of course, for them, it confirmed that the end times were truly at hand. So I'll stop there and hand back over to James to talk a bit more about the sort of the what happened next question, which I think is also really important.
The part of what we were doing and wanted to do was not simply to have this as a life and that's that. We wanted to contextualise this in the broader sweep of history and why an entire movement emerged in his name. So the movement does survive, obviously, and there are immediate reasons for this. Oddly, the resurrection can be, even as a strict historian as myself, would take the claims about the resurrection quite seriously, in the sense that these are very early, about the earliest material we have concerning Jesus that people claim to have seen him after his death. Now, I'm not getting into any of those silly arguments about, this really happened, it's supernatural, all that kind of nonsense. That's for theologians and philosophers, not me. As a historian, it's very clear people did claim to have visions, that they claimed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. That bit is actually not really up for dispute. So to some extent, that does help the movement continue, the idea that the figure has been vindicated and can move on. But I think there are broader, more important material reasons why the movement survived. I think some of the networks are important, the social networks that existed. Basic level, people would have encountered the movement at Passover and gone off to wherever else they lived. Also, these networks that we talked about fishing networks were important, tax collector networks, which were intersected with fishing networks. Tax collectors would collect tax from. But for it to survive, it can't just be a parochial peasant movement. It wouldn't have lasted very long, it wouldn't have spread very long. And very early on in the process, it seems, we get mediating figures in the form of scribes, village scribe or whatever, which helps this stuff to be written down and spread in that sense. Elite women seem to have been important. We do have examples of elite women attracted to Judaism in that part of the world. Continues in that sense. Other networks are important, though, as this continues throughout the Mediterranean world. Synagogues or Jewish associations or gatherings are important. They were a point of contact right across the Eastern Mediterranean, where figures like Paul and so on could go straight away into whatever centre and go to the synagogue. Workplaces were another important means of the movement spreading. And if you want to understand why religious movements or even political movements grow and spread, it's because of social networks. The ideas are wonderful, I'm sure, but ideas don't really help movements survive. It's friendship, workplace, things like that. That's how people tend to be persuaded and convinced. And I think the origins of Christianity are no different in that sense, and there's good evidence for it. But this means people start having multiple allegiances. So in a synagogue, for instance, you would, of course, get the local Jewish community, but you would also get non-Jews attracted to Jewish ideas, and this could range from people wanting to embrace as much of Judaism as they can to people who are sort of generally vaguely interested in what goes on in Jewish life. So that's where the point of contact gets made with non-Jews, and for the movement to spread out in that sense. And once those connections are made, you've got people who would act in a Jewish manner in a synagogue, for instance, but could act however the hell they liked outside that. They may act, they may not care less about food laws, for instance. They may eat pork and so on and so forth. And so quickly, this helps explain why this movement spreads as both Jewish and in non-Jewish circles quite rapidly in the first century. And this is also why that phrase sinners is important. It provides the ideological justification for this growing social network of people from different ethnic backgrounds, because in Jewish texts, the other meaning of sinners is Gentile, non-Jew, because it takes on a stereotypical function. You know what non-Jewish nations are like. They're greedy, they're oppressive, they're lawless, and so on. And this is why I think some of this language of sinners is very important for that movement to spread and justify why you've got such a mixed group of people. This also is the beginnings of why you start getting the breakup between what is identified as a Jewish movement and what is identified as a not Jewish movement, and why Christianity becomes essentially a non-Jewish religion in the long run. And so by the time we get into the first century, some of the key things are taking place. You've got justification for non-Jews. They don't have to observe any of the Jewish law or anything like that. No, not much of it, at least. But you've also got God, or is this a God of the Gentiles? And John's Gospel has got some very significant discussions of this. And John's Gospel, we think, is reflective of developments in Christianity at the end of the first century, beginning of the second century, perhaps. And here we start in the ideas about, is Jesus equal with God, framed and constructed in disputes with a group called the Jews, who seek to kill Jesus according to John's Gospel. And we think this is, in narrative form, a way of trying to explain the difference between this emerging non-Jewish movement, or at least not traditionally Jewish movement, and what would become Christianity with the local Jewish community. So we start getting... This is tying in with all sorts of discussions and debates about the idea of an overarching God in the ancient world. It wasn't just Christians and Jews who thought in terms of an overarching God. This was wider than that. And this had been a development of empire over centuries. If you've got an empire, you need a God to rule the empire as well, with the representative on earth as the emperor. In trade connections, road connections, and things like this, local gods start becoming a bit of a problem. You want a God that can cover all of this, who's a God of all different nations and so on and so forth. And those debates start happening in the second, third, and fourth centuries. A local God doesn't work. We need a big And that's where, and in the long run, Christianity takes on that role and Jesus takes on the role of the God of empire, effectively, or at least a part of the God of empire. Tensions remain. That's not the end of the story. It does become the God of empire. Christianity does become the religion of empire in the long run because it spreads so widely and fairly rapidly. But the tensions between the parables about rich people being damned and the stories about the eye of the needle, is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. All this stuff's still there. And as this Christianity becomes part of the Roman Empire, later on into medieval Europe and so on, it's effectively the only language. So it also becomes the language of revolt as well. It becomes the language of peasant uprisings in medieval Europe, for instance. So there's a tension in the language, there's a tension in the ideology, that it's the ideology of the ruling class, but it's also the language of those who want to revolt against it. And that tension in Christianity remains to this day. It happens with the emergence of capitalism as well. Socialists take on the language of the Bible, of revolt and revolution and so on, from the Christian tradition. In many ways, it gets secularized and says it's absorbed. In some ways, Christians join in with the debate against the ruling class. But that fracturing of Christianity, it becomes a key part of its history to this day. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah,
and happily open up for questions.